In this video, I'm going to teach you how to make food sculptures using toilet tissue paper and water. Yes, all you need to build these sculptures is toilet paper. One roll is plenty. I only used about 1/4 to 1/6 of the roll total to make my burger sculpture and a container filled with water. I'm also going to be placing my sculpture onto a movable paper plate so that I can move them to dry in another location. Before starting a sculpture, I always think about what do I want to make. For my example, I'm going to create a BLT burger, and so I first look at some pictures of what BLTs look like. Then I start creating. To make flat things like my bacon and lettuce, I first layer some dry toilet paper. I then dip it carefully into water and I tear the toilet paper while it's wet. You also could cut the toilet paper with scissors when it's wet or when it's dry. When sculpting bacon, I'll position the pieces, which are going to be the bacon, how I want them to dry on my plate. You'll be surprised. As the toilet paper dries, it really firms up and it will hold the shape that you leave it in. Next, when sculpting lettuce, I simply tear the layered wet toilet paper into different sized pieces. These pieces will become the torn lettuce leaves. Again, always let your pieces dry the way you want them to firm up. Okay, next for sculpting tomato slices, I layer the toilet paper, wet it, and then fold it and bend it. I use the same process for the inside pieces for the tomato as well, but in this case, to attach them onto the outside edge, I use some additional layers of wet toilet paper over the connection points. I do this on both sides, which is very important because I want to make sure that these additional pieces stay on. I'm going to make one more tomato slice, so go ahead and watch for a review. Again, make sure to secure attachments on all sides. This should feel very similar to working on a paper mache sculpture where you're adding those layers of paper into any weak spots to make sure that you are holding them on tightly. When making thick things like ball forms, begin with a dry ball of toilet paper first, and then wrap the dry ball form with a wet toilet paper layer. This is what I'll be doing for both top and bottom sides of the bun. Use as much dry toilet paper as possible for the insides of all of your big forms. This will help your project dry more quickly. If a large form is too soaked with water, it could start to mold before it's able to dry. So that is why a dry core is so important. Notice how I layer the toilet paper to make a sheet for more coverage when I'm trying to add on those wet outside layers. I wrap, tear off the excess, and then mold the form in my hands. I also always squeeze out excess water before sculpting. To make a flat geometric form like a piece of cheese, I fold the layered wet toilet paper, but I also could have cut it with scissors. When sculpting my meat patty, I use the wet wrapping on a dry form yet again. This time, I'm tearing the dry form's edges to keep it round and flat. Then I wrap it with wet sheets of toilet paper and smooth and mold it with my hands. Next, I'll discuss some tips. If your project isn't smooth, you could wrap it in additional layers. I needed to add additional layers many times throughout my project. If your project gets too wet, squeeze out the excess water. Another tip is if any part of your project is too small, build it up using more layers. You can use dry or semi-dry layers topped with an additional wet layer. I had to do this a lot to make my buns larger. In fact, watch here how I layer and apply a large covering sheet. Look at how I place those layers of toilet paper in different directions. Get them slightly wet and then place my bun onto the sheet, and I kind of wrap it all up. I squeeze out any excess, and then I mold it in my hands. I even applied a few additional sheets of toilet paper just to help smooth it out. At this point, my burger is really coming along. But before I let it dry, I look over each piece to smooth, secure, or add additional details. For example, I added some sesame seeds to the top of my bun by using small, wet pieces of toilet paper that I rolled up. To make sure that my seeds would stay on, I just placed a thin layer of wet toilet paper over the seeded bun to hold down the seeds. And I used my fingers to help press and mold the seeds into place and to make the area around the seeds a little bit lower. To prepare for drying, I separated all of the parts of my burger, and I then placed my plate outside in the sun, and I let it all dry for at least 48 hours. When fully dry, a toilet paper sculpture should feel a bit like dry, stale bread. It should be completely firm, and the shapes and forms should remain in the same position that they dried out in. Whenever your pieces are fully dry, it's then time to paint them. I'll be using watercolor paint to paint my food sculpture. I'm going to look at reference photos to create colors and details that appear real, and I highly recommend that you do too. Mix water with your paint in your paint palette. You will need to paint in layers as it absorbs very quickly into the toilet paper. You will notice that the paint doesn't flow well. It kind of sinks in and somewhat expands into the toilet paper food. As the watercolor soaks in, you want to make sure you're very gentle with your sculptures. The toilet paper will soften, but it should not become soggy and soaked. Let it dry between layers if it does become too wet. Remember that adding more water to the paint means you'll create a lighter color, and when you add less water to the paint, your color will be more vivid. While this is probably common sense to you, remember you are creating a three-dimensional sculpture, which means you need to paint all sides of everything. Add, mix, and layer paint to create more realistic color variations. You will notice that the color will fade somewhat as it dries. Adding additional layers is helpful. I added some white paint for my sesame seeds and some extra red paint for my tomato skin. I also added some grill marks and texture on my burger with black paint. A mixture of orange and yellow was perfect for painting the cheddar cheese, and I used green, yellow, and brown for my lettuce. Painting the bacon was really fun. I used some watered down red and brown and even a tiny bit of black on the edges to make the bacon look extra crispy. I think the end results look good enough to eat. It really can look like real food. To keep your food sculpture looking more vibrant in color and to give it some shine, you could add on some kind of varnish. This could be an acrylic medium or Mod Podge. And lastly, plate your food neatly for a nice display. Make sure you take plenty of photographs as well. Thanks for watching this video, and I hope you enjoy making food sculptures with toilet tissue paper.